Buddy? Okay, don't talk to me. Welcome to Cafe Conversations. Hi. Okay, a few announcements before we get started. Of course, today we have John Gilliom, who's going to talk to us about the death of Big Brother and the rise of the surveillance society. That seems a lot scarier than most of the science versions of this. So, we have several things to realize. We have a Facebook page. We have a Twitter comment. So if you're interested in following along and finding out what the other Science Cafe and Cafe Conversation topics are, you can follow us on there. We are videotaping this, so you can share it with our alums and with other people if people have to miss it. So we are videotaping it. We're live streaming. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Roxanne Mole-Bruni and let her give you a few more announcements, and then I'll be back.
Yeah, this is sort of a message from our sponsor kind of thing. When we started the Science Cafes, we were funded by the 1804 Fund, which is a foundation fund, and for 3 years they were great and they funded these programs. And then we expanded and we had our Cafe Conversation series, which is sort of our non-science science cafes. Within the last couple years, though, we have actually transitioned over to funding from sponsors like you. God, I feel like PBS right now. But here we go. So basically what I'm asking is that if you are willing, please consider donating to the Fund for Undergraduate and Graduate Research, which funds the Student Expo, the Undergraduate Travel Fund, as well as the Science Cafes and the Cafe Conversations. To date, we have over 300 sponsors, and the average is about $10 each, and that's great. And if anybody wants to donate, all you have to do is go to our Facebook page, and you can message us and tell us how much you want to give. Regretfully, we don't have that little text, thing that they do for like the American Red Cross, but we're working towards it. So we appreciate your support, but more than that, we appreciate the fact that you are here today. So thank you.
Okay, so that was this from our sponsors. Now back to the business. We have several upcoming cafes. The next cafe we're going to have, the Science Cafe, next week is Larry Whitmer from the College of Medicine. He works with dinosaurs. I can guarantee it will be an interesting thing. He brings all kinds of dinosaur pieces and parts and has them around the cafe, so you may want to come and check that one out. We have a few things that we need the faculty and the undergrads to know. We have Sigma Xi grants. This is Science Cafe is a product of Sigma Xi, which is the honorary research society. The Sigma Xi grants and aids are due October 15th. They're for undergraduates and graduate students. So you can get up to $1,000 for all fields, all disciplines. You can actually get $2,500 for vision-related research and up to $5,000 for astronomy. So it's worth checking out if you're in any of those fields, or if you're an undergrad or grad student doing biology or science in any of these departments. They're really quite interesting little grants, and it gives you a chance to have a grant on your CV. With that, I want everybody to notice T-shirts. We have T-shirts for Cafe Conversations. These are different from Science Cafes. These are Cafe Conversations. Dun, 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 dun. This one's mine. They give me one for just standing around doing nothing. But you guys can get them too. The way to get a T-shirt is to interact. You ask a question, make a comment, interact with the speaker, and you get a T-shirt. Pretty simple deal. Okay? With that, I will turn this over to John. John. He used to be up there. I did that earlier. This is John Gilliom from Political Science, going to talk to us about the surveillance society. There
you go. Was that Matt? Sorry about this, people. Test, test, test. Does that sound good right there if I talk like that? Does that work? Okay, while we're I want to do a little project before we start. Can I ask how many people in earshot have a cell phone with them? Okay, if anybody has theirs turned off right now, please maybe just turn it on while we get started. Check and see if you've got any texts. Send a little Twitter or something like that, and then we'll get back to business.
Sound okay?
Can you hear in the back? Lori, is that okay?
No.
Volume. Whoa. Volume. Okay. This is all right. Do you want me to keep talking? How's that? How's that?
Nope.
Not good? Not good?
Not good.
Not good yet. Not good. But we're going to get better. So just keep sending texts. You've got lots of friends out there. Update your Facebook page. There's all sorts of things you could do to help us out here. So, yeah, the reason, okay. Are we stabilized now? Okay. The little cell phone thing I do is so that we can all kind of feel safer being here together, because now there's really no strangers here. When you activate your cell phone, it makes a mark of where you are, and because of your account identity, it registers with your cell phone service provider and therefore the NSA, so who you are. It does where you are, either using tower location or GPS positioning. And it also allows, at a later date, somebody can go in and see who all your friends are. So it can kind of place your social network by seeing who you call and who you text. So there's not a single person. I think everybody here had a cell phone, which means there's not a single person here where we're not pretty confident of who they are, where they are at this moment. We could backtrack and see where they've been. And we can also, very importantly, see who all their friends are. And for that reason, my co-author Torrin Monahan and I, in our recent book, Supervision, argue that cell phones are like the Swiss knife of the surveillance society. I feel like I'm going in and out here. They have multiple uses. Not only do you get identity confirmation, you can location, you can get social networking, as I said. You have a nice handy camera, which can usually do still and video footage and upload it. You can also access your Facebook page and check in on your friends and what they're doing if you've got a smartphone. Some of you are able to send tweets on them. I'm not sure you're aware, but every tweet you send goes to the Library of Congress, where they're all being logged for future anthropologists to look at. And cell phones are just having this amazing impact on our life. They're turning up in trials, doing amazing things. There's this one story that came out of Miami a couple years ago where two guys from, I guess it's the Greek mafia out of New Jersey, had been sent down to Miami to kill this guy. And the guy they were supposed to kill was sitting in a Beamer in the downtown area, and the two hitmen approached the car collaborating on their cell phones. They were talking to each other about where the car was, and then they were moving forward and moving forward. Well, it turns out they did the hit. The guy was dead, and that part's kind of sad. But the really cool part of the story is that later on, the prosecutors were able to go back through the cell phone data and, using the positioning information, make a map for the jury of these two guys approaching the car where the dead guy was found, and it made the conviction a lot easier. Cell phones have been turning up in a lot of custody and divorce type cases. I won't tell you all the details about this poor family in Oklahoma, but should you go to a remote motel for an illicit meeting with someone, you may not want to bring your cell phone in with you and leave it on, because it is transmitting your GPS location. They've also been turning up in finding lost people, particularly lost children, runaways. In some cases, people who have been abducted. Police are able to figure out where they are and go rescue them. And then they've been a big help to the DEA and the FBI in dismantling drug rings. When people communicate with each other by cell phone, as a couple guys over here are doing right now, you're leaving constant tracks. And it's not tracks in the sand, it's tracks in wet concrete. You are leaving constant tracks of who you've been talking to. So for heaven's sakes, if you've got a cousin who's a small-time drug dealer, don't text with them, don't talk with them on the cell phone, because you are registering as a member of the network that surrounds that person. And you can just imagine how powerful that tool has been used for for law enforcement. So the cell phone's just one example. I could have started the lecture with a whole bunch of others. Credit cards. Credit cards leave this, as people shift to plastic, they leave this complete set of footprints about where you've been, what you're doing, what your behavior is. Probably everybody here either has a student ID or an employee ID or a driver's license. Our campus here is a little bit behind the times on this, at least in most buildings, but many campuses, particularly smaller ones where it's not so expensive to retrofit everything, your ID card has a function where you can just walk through a doorway and attendance is taken. You just walk up to a doorway and it opens if you're authorized. You just walk by a vending facility in a cafeteria and it pays for the stuff. Just incredible convenience, and it also monitors exactly where you are and in case of purchases what you're doing. There was a great case where there was an arson on a college campus. Turned out the kid was trying to burn down the registrar's office because he had realized he couldn't make his F go away. So he tried to burn down the registrar's office, and they were able to find that the fuel, the gasoline, had been put in a Gatorade bottle, and they were able to find the Gatorade bottle. It didn't completely incinerate, and they could track it back to the campus convenience store by the product number, where it had been sold, and which student account it had been sold to, and they went to the kid's room and he started crying. And that was the end of the story. So there's just amazing things that we can do with these tools. Now, the story goes on. Schools, when you go to school, no child left behind, no child left untested. You've been assessed, you've been watched, you've been measured. When you go to work, believe me, the same thing happens. For those of you who don't have full-time jobs now, all sorts of assessment and things like that going on. If you use Gmail, I assume everybody knows this, but Gmail has these machines that read all of your mail. You know, that's like when I send a friend a note about how I'm going to go on this camping trip, suddenly there's banner ads around my web browsing for new tents and hiking boots and pads and things like that. You may have noticed that happening. That's what's going on. They're checking out your mail. These are just, so that's like I'm going to sort of stop with the long list of examples. But what I'm trying to portray for you is just lots of evidence that something has changed in our world, and we're now in this new environment where surveillance is a big part of what we do. Now, one of my main goals today, not my main goal today, is to get you to rethink this thing called surveillance. Because what I find when I talk to most people is they're thinking, when they hear the word surveillance, they think a black van without windows with 3 federal agents with big earphones sitting there smoking cigarettes 24 hours a day, and that's kind of surveillance. And that's not what we're talking about. That's a very, very tiny, bizarre subset of what we're talking about. The word surveillance comes from 2 French words. And I do not have a workable French accent, so those of you who are taking French, please do not follow along. There is the sur part, which means from above, and there's the valence part, which means to watch. So surveillance simply means to watch from above. It's exactly the same as words like oversee, watch from above, oversee, or the title of my latest book, supervision, vision from above. So it's it's one variation of a lot of words we use. Surveillance, supervision, oversight, it all means the same thing. And it's typically defined in our field as simply monitoring people in order to regulate or govern behavior. Monitoring people in order to regulate or govern behavior. So if you're just checking folks out, that's probably not surveillance. But if you're reading student papers in order to see who's going to get what grade and who gets to go to law school, that's surveillance. You're monitoring people in order to regulate or govern their behavior. It really fuses the idea of information or vision, the valence part, with the idea of power, the above part. And that's what originally got me very fascinated in it as a young political scientist back in the 80s, because there was some really good new social theory happening about different types of power in society. And one of those new types of power was this power of vision, which hadn't really been studied in political science at all before, where people were looking at traditional things like voting and money and lobbyists and guns and missiles. And then somebody came along and said, well, there's also looking. And all the older guys I was working with were like, whoa. And for us, it was just this great idea to get out and explore new ways of thinking about power. So, surveillance, simply monitoring people in order to regulate or govern behavior. And so my co-author and I call this, and many of our colleagues call this, a surveillance society, simply because the idea of surveillance permeates so many of the things we do. You go to school, you go to work, you drive your car, you get your groceries, you go out to eat, you take a class, you're sitting right here with your cell phone in your pocket. You know, when we get together and tell surveillance jokes at conferences, we call them citizen location devices instead of cell phones. We're a funny group of guys. And so you're basically being under some form of surveillance in almost any dimension of your life. So, most people who write about surveillance and who talk about surveillance are really kind of grim about the whole thing. In fact, when I was milling about the stage getting ready, 2 different people walked up to me and said, "This sounds like a really scary talk." But it's not. It's a key part of my message today. Big Brother's dead. The whole grim part, you got to get over that. I mean, there are some parts of it that are grim. I mean, there are people sitting in jail and things like that because of surveillance. But there's also a lot of really, really neat stuff going on because of surveillance and its rise. Think of of the impact of things like the LSAT and the ACT and the credit score. These are all technocratic rating tools which replace traditional tools of assessing people like racism and ethnic prejudice and who your dad knew, and they give people kind of a cleaner shot in life. They're a form of surveillance which actually opens up avenues that are liberatory for people. Or think about some of the fun stuff. So tonight at some point I'll probably log on to Netflix to see, what DVD's coming next, and it's going to have all these neat recommendations for me. It's going to say, "Hey, you'd like National Lampoon's 13 or something like that." And that's because it's watching how I evaluate movies, it's comparing me to other customers, and it's using a logarithm, and it's giving me suggestions. Amazon can do the same thing. Zappos has similar functions. We're getting lots of good suggestions from the surveillance software about what we might want to do. Okay, other good stuff happening. Lost hikers in the woods. It's really hard to get lost in America if you've got electronics with you. And lost hikers have been found, runaway kids have been found, people who are unconscious at scenes of accidents have been found, cars which go off the road and the drivers are unconscious have been found because most modern cars have some sort of GPS or OnStar capacity. So there's all sorts of really good stuff happening. Now, I'm not like a total Pollyanna. There's also some grim stuff going on. A lot of you might have Nokia phones. The Nokia Corporation is right now the subject of an international boycott because they collaborated with the Iranian government and used cell phone records to round up and jail the young people who led the Iranian protest during the initial phase of the Arab Spring uprisings. It's not a happy side to surveillance. That might even be getting back to our friend Big Brother a little bit. We've also learned a lot in the popular press recently with revelations about what the NSA has been doing with surveillance information, and I'll loop back to that. And that's discomforting for a lot of people. I got to tell you, in terms of the Snowden revelations and what the NSA has been doing in its work with the cell phone providers and things like that, when that story broke, everyone I work with in surveillance studies was like, yeah, duh. Pretty much a known secret inside the business. It's just what the revelations did for us was bring out clear evidence that it was actually happening. But I think it's been widely assumed that it's been happening for a long time. So the point here, and it's a main point, is that surveillance in today's society is good, it's bad, it's ugly, it's mean, it's fun, it's scary, it's meaningless, it's very meaningful, it's got all these different dimensions, and that's because we're now in a surveillance society. It's part of our lives, it's in the fabric of our existence, it's where we live. It's not just a momentary intrusion. It is our context, and so it has to be all of these different things. It has to be this very confusing and difficult thing to understand. Okay, so that's kind of the premise of this book, and I wanted to take some of the best thoughts out of the book. I'm going to check the clock here real quick. Oh, we're in great shape. The book actually has, in its first chapter, it lays out 10 big ideas about the surveillance society that we then explore in the book. And I was originally going to try and do all 10. But then Roxanne said, no, you don't want to keep me here for like 2 hours. We want this to be about 20 minutes and then a lot of Q&A. And then the other thing I realized was, if I gave you all 10, you wouldn't have any reason to buy the book. So we're going to do like 3 or 4. I'm just going to tease your appetite. And then you can go to Amazon and drop $10.42 on the ebook. And you can then enjoy it in the comfort of your own home. Okay, so big idea number 1. And this is the part of the title which originally made me think of this talk of the death of Big Brother. We need an absolutely and fundamentally new vocabulary for talking about surveillance. I occasionally do public speaking gigs at different universities around the country, and nearly everyone, and I talk with journalists about surveillance, nearly everyone who contacts me the first time, they want to set up a surveillance versus privacy debate. We're going to have a debate. I'm like, oh, really? What's that going to be about? Oh, we thought we'd do surveillance versus privacy. Oh, for God's sake. It's like this culture is trapped in this conversation in which surveillance is pitted against privacy, and that's the only thing we can talk about. Privacy is just one little tiny, aging, and increasingly irrelevant dimension of the discussion we should be having about surveillance. Big Brother, the other key concept, is it's an old concept which has nothing to do with the nature of what's happening in our society. It was this scary, abusive, totalitarian, all-encompassing force, very unitary and monetary. What we've got in this culture in our surveillance is this dispersed. It's done by small businesses. It's done by your professors. It's done by your friends. You're doing it to yourself on Facebook. You're having fun with most of it. It's not scary. It's not going to lead to some terrifying room where you end up meeting the greatest terror in existence. So the Big Brother model doesn't work, and I'm also going to argue the privacy model doesn't work. Privacy is increasingly irrelevant to what we're talking about with surveillance. Now, there's a few reasons for that. One is because the courts are doing almost nothing to protect any rights of privacy that exist. Here, particularly here in the United States. Over in Europe, the courts and the legislatures are actually doing a little more active work to protect their citizens. And it's making major trouble for Google and some of the other groups because things that they design in the United States, they simply can't use in Europe because of laws. But here in the United States, it's very, very rare that you see privacy get defended, and it's only in some of the most egregious kind of police state examples. And I'll be back to some of that stuff later on. But the other thing is for most of the key and exciting dimensions of surveillance that I can think about that I move down quickly. So I'm thinking like Gmail, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, enrolling here at Ohio University, getting a job, buying a car with an OnStar. These are all things that we're doing to ourselves, and we're usually signing a form or clicking a box that says, yeah, I agree to all of this. And I'm not like singling anybody out, I do it myself. You know, you're like, oh, I'm going to try this software. Yeah, I agree to that. And whoever goes and reads what you're agreeing to, don't. It'll really freak you out. Just never read that stuff. Just go, I agree, and keep on living your life. But when you do that, you waive all your rights to privacy. You have no meaningful claim. Another reason, and I'm just going to do 3, I could go on for a whole book, why privacy is getting to be irrelevant is a lot of the surveillance that we're facing and dealing with is in very public places. I'm in this conversation once with a guy who was hacked off because a yellow light camera had been installed at one of the intersections on a commute, and people were getting all of these tickets for blowing through. It's a violation of privacy. And I'm like, how the hell is that a violation of privacy? You're using a state-issued license and a state-registered vehicle to be on a public highway where you're totally out in plain day. All they're doing is taking a photograph of the exterior of your car when you break the law. There is nobody who can find a reasonable expectation of privacy in that situation. It's irrelevant. Now, that doesn't help this guy who's still mad, who's still frustrated, but the word privacy does not get to what he's talking about. So what we do in the book is we pull apart just like I've done, except we do it with more footnotes and a lot longer sentences. We pull apart the idea of Big Brother, we pull apart the idea of privacy, and we pull apart the sort of dichotomy we've inherited between surveillance and privacy, and we argue that they're not a really useful vocabulary for us to use. Now, our editor tried real hard to get us to write a chapter which said new vocabulary, but we don't do that because we basically want to present this as a challenge to all of you who are growing up and like coming in at an earlier stage in the surveillance society to rethink this. So our project is really to raise lots of questions and not give lots of answers. Okay, so that's big idea number one, the need for new vocabulary. Big idea number two is kind of different, but it's in the same theme. Almost all the traditional takes on what surveillance is assume as a premise an unwilling population. But as we've said before, we're signing up for most of this stuff. It's a rite of passage in the United States to get your own cell phone. I can remember that moment in I need a cell phone. Everyone's got a cell. Okay, have a cell phone. Here, kid, have your government tracking device and carry it in your pocket at all times. It's a rite of passage to be old enough to get on Facebook and have a Facebook page. Then you start friending people. We are signing up for surveillance so eagerly that it's like an enlister's dream. We're a volunteer army signing up for this project. Now, that creates a lot of troubles for traditional thinking about surveillance and a whole slew of old books about surveillance which totally assume this oppositional relationship of Big Brother doing surveillance and the citizen going, oh, leave me alone, leave me alone. In this situation, it's like the citizens are out in front saying, give me a cell phone, give me Facebook, give me all this stuff because I want it. And so that's really confounding to a lot of philosophers who deal with surveillance. Okay, big idea number three. Big government isn't your problem, or it's not your problem alone. Big business is a big part of the problem. And we're seeing a really fascinating emergence of cooperative relationships between big government and big business. And perhaps the best example is just recently with the revelations about the NSA stuff that's been coming out. And if you haven't been following it, I know a lot of the students in the room are at a very, very busy time in their life. And I certainly had a hard time checking in with the mass media when I was in college because there's so much other reading to do. But there's some really amazing revelations going on. And what we're seeing here is that not only was the intelligence industry, the NSA, using private contractors to do their intelligence work, so they're hiring companies to do it, those companies are then setting up relationships with your cell phone provider and with your internet service provider, and those companies are giving them complete and utter free rein to go through the records of what's been going on. And so that means, and that has been done on foreign nationals, on United States citizens, on United States businesses, on the president of Brazil. It's like no holds barred. And a big part of that is because once you move into the private sector, and this is going to link back to an earlier theme, once you move into the private sector, you're dealing with not a bunch of citizens, but a bunch of consumers who did what? They clicked that little box that said, I agree. So when you signed up with your cell phone provider, when you signed up with Facebook, you said you agreed to abide by the policies. There's probably a non-litigation clause in there, and you said, I agree. Okay, that means that it's free rein. And so what the courts have said is that everything that you produce for Facebook or for your cell phone provider or for your internet service provider, except for the actual conversation on the phone itself, but who you called, when you called, and where you were, how long the call lasted, that sort of stuff, that's all what's just called a business record. And there are no privacy interests in a business record. So there's a whole bunch of information that's been gathered by the private sector and then turned over either under court order or for sale to the public sector where the government can now use it. But more importantly, I would argue, the most meaningful surveillance in your life is actually not from the government. If you asked me, should I be really worried about the NSA surveillance program? The answer for most people in the room is going to be probably not. It's really focused on some other issues that we hope you're not involved with. But then you said, should I be worried about test scores and credit scores and health insurance records and what the data aggregators are doing and all these different things in the private sector? My answer would be, yeah, you should be paying a lot of attention to that, because that's going to affect your credit rating. It's going to affect whether you can borrow the money to get a house. It's going to affect whether you can get a job. All of these factors are being used to make big decisions about your life. So I would say the NSA thing is a really big deal for students of government and formal constitutional lawyers and things like that. But for most of us living our little insignificant lives here somewhere in Ohio, the stuff that's going on with our bankers and our insurance companies and other things is probably more important in our lives. That's why I would argue that the real problem isn't from, or not the sole problem isn't from big government. We got some real issues with big business. And if you haven't heard about 3 companies, Axiom, ChoicePoint, and SeisNet, please go out and do some Google Play later on. Those companies are called data aggregators, and they are in the sole business of gathering information about you, frequently from public areas like Bureau of Motor Vehicles, the courthouses, educational records that they can get their hands on, financial reports and things like that. And they aggregate it together and use algorithms to make predictions about your life that can then affect your insurance prospects. It affects what sort of campaign literature you get, what sort of ad pitches you get. So they are very, very important companies in all of our lives. We're making great time. Okay, now we're going to get a little bit Star Trek-y on you here, because I'm going to argue that in the surveillance society, we're really messing around with the forces of space and time. Okay, what do I mean by that? Let me tell you a little story. And it'll show you the breakdown of space and time and demonstrate a neat little trick in the surveillance society. So let's picture Panama City, spring break, and then 6 months later, a financial analyst in Chicago sitting in a skyscraper looking at his computer screen. And let me tell you the story that this individual is going to see on that computer screen. And it's kind of sad, and so I hope this doesn't bum you out. 5812, 5813, 5921, 7273, 7297, 7995, 5933, 9223, 8111. Isn't that a drag? Does anybody know what that story means? Anybody got a guess? Yes, it's something to do with credit. Those are merchant codes from some poor individual's credit card transaction history. 5812 is a restaurant. Things are getting off to a good start. 5813 is a bar. 5921 is a liquor store. 7273 is an escort service. 7297 is a massage parlor. 7995 is gambling. 5933, pawn shop. The gambling didn't go so well. 9223, something bad happened because it's a bail bondsman. And then finally, 8111 is an attorney. So there's a story in those numbers, and when that guy reads the story in Chicago, and it could be the same day, it could be 3 months later, it could be 30 years later, because they don't throw this stuff away, it tells a story about a person. And the credit card companies do use that to affect your credit ratings and your credit limits. And then landlords do look at your credit ratings to make decisions about whether you're going to lease to you. And even though they're not quite supposed to, employers do look at your credit ratings in order to make decisions about whether to hire you. And auto insurance issuers, even though they're not supposed to, frequently, they may have gotten prohibited a couple months ago, but they had been looking at this to make decisions about how much they should charge you, because people with bad credit get in more accidents. I don't know why, but that's what the PowerPoint, the Excel spreadsheet says, so they charge them more. So that story tells you a little bit about credit, but it also demonstrates how we're entering into this environment where snapshots from different points in your life are going to be able to, they're going to be put together at later places using algorithms and techniques that we haven't even thought about. You know, people are now just getting startled to realize that there is now face recognition software so that we can go through all the photographs that have been posted on the internet and search for you by your face, and we don't even need to know your name. It doesn't have to be like tagged to you with like, here's my friend Pat. The computer can figure that out. It can sort all the pictures from Pat that have been posted on both current internet and archived internet and pull these things out. That's going to be an amazing tool. I mean, I hire people. I make decisions about when we do employment searches. How cool would that be to just sit there like little brother and like look all through the internet for every snapshot that's ever been posted of this individual. And these things are being archived. There's companies that specialize in archiving segments of the web so that research can be done later. There's just all this neat stuff going on that totally challenge the way that you and I think about location and the way that we think about time and our moment in history, because we are leaving footprints in the cement. Okay. I already did that one, so I'm going to skip ahead and move to the last big idea because I want to save some questions. So this one is actually kind of, to me, it's both the most fascinating and at times the most, it's got a little bit of distress in it, but mostly I've been doing it long enough that it's now just fascination. I'm not sure that there's anything we can do to build a meaningful conversation about surveillance in our society. If you assume basically that privacy is toast as a workable concept, which I think it is, it's really hard to imagine where the new language comes from. Where does the new, if you want to raise criticism of this, if you want to engage in a discussion of it, where's the traction? Where's the language with which to talk about it? Privacy worked great in the 19th century and a big part of the 20th century, but it's just not up to it's like an old boxer. It's just worn out. It's not up to the new tactics. And if you think about it, there is all this energy in many dimensions of our cultural life that is pro-surveillance, in favor of the use of information. I'm at the Science Cafe. I got friends who are scientists. My boss is a scientist. What does he always say? Show me the data. You know, people do research in the sciences. They do empirical research. They worship free access to information. That's what it's all about. That's the fundamental principle of scientific research. Give me the information. Science loves surveillance. What about basic rationality? I work in political science and government, and we talk a lot about rationality. One of the first principles of working with the principle of rationality in political science is that you talk about the idea of perfect information, and you want to get out there and get all the information you can about a situation before you act. And that's a standard of good leadership in books about how to be a leader or an administrator. You make sure you get all of the information. You're going to grab all the surveillance you can get because you want that information. What about law? Well, let me put it this way. One of the most famous lines from law, from all of law, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Law loves information. It's really, really hard for judges and lawyers to suppress evidence, although they do it sometimes. The law loves to have more information. I would argue it's structurally pro-surveillance. And then also, I'll just throw in religion for grins, where we have almost every religion has some form of an all-knowing, all-seeing God. And then we can throw in Christmas, where Santa Claus knows whether you've been naughty or nice. Okay, so all these different cultural forces, all of these different language structures, science, rationality, religion, law, they all want more surveillance. And then you got this little 19th century idea, privacy, privacy. I don't think the odds are looking too good for this one. And so I don't have happy predictions about like where the discussion is going to go, but what I hope I can do is make this through today's talk, or perhaps through this amazing book, a vital presence in your life so that you're rethinking your social context from the perspective of some of these questions. And when you post on Facebook or pull out your cell phone or swipe your credit card or get in your car, think about it from that angle and just kind of be an aware participant in the surveillance society. And so on that, I will stop, and we can do Q&A, or you can throw things, or whatever you want to do. Yes?
So earlier you mentioned you have people that like email you and they're concerned about the debate between surveillance and privacy. And I think it's a little bit misleading to lump things like Facebook or your credit card history in with what people are really afraid of, and that's government surveillance. So my question is like, when you're talking about surveillance and you're talking about all these great things that everybody here voluntarily consents to,
Mm-hmm.
how do you account for the fact that like people don't necessarily like consent to the government surveillance and not these companies?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, I don't think I'm gonna be able to do that.
No, just so the audience.
So everyone can hear it. I think I can. I think I can do it, and it's a fantastic question. Yeah, you got a T-shirt. That was good. The question is that basically I wasn't being entirely straightforward. Is it okay if I sort of condense? Entirely straightforward, because I'm taking all the fun stuff like Facebook and Amazon and Netflix, which everybody's into, and I'm lumping it together with the scary stuff like the NSA and big government, which people aren't into, and I'm kind of saying that it's a very similar thing. My answer would be yes, that's what I'm doing. I'm part of an academic movement which is attempting to broaden the definition of surveillance so that we think of these things as one composite rather than totally different things. And I would actually argue in your real life they are one thing, because we do know that the groups which might bug you, like, so to speak, the groups which might irritate you, like let's say the FBI, the DEA, the NSA, they're using Facebook and Google and your email and your cell phone stuff that you signed up for to generate their reports. And so I've got friends who have done articles and stuff actually arguing that basically something like Facebook is the gateway drug to the surveillance society. And you basically get all these kids looped in and they get used to recording their every activity. Well, not only do they get used to being surveyed, but they're creating the database which then, the agents of Big Brother, the sort of traditional boogeymen, they can use to do their job. So I would actually argue, I think you're correct to point out that distinction. I think it's really important. But I will also argue that it's more important to focus on the fusion. Yeah?
My question is kind of simple, but I was just wondering, what would the consequences be of trying to convince the U.S. government that you are a terrorist by looking up pressure cookers or how to hijack a plane or something like that? Would you use the excuse that, I was just doing it for fun, or would they say that that's tampering with our way of dealing with terrorism and stuff like that?
Repeat the question.
I will repeat the question. The question is, would it be a fun idea this weekend to Google pressure cooker, fertilizer, alarm clocks, and the word bomb, and just sort of kind of see what happens? That would not be a good idea. I don't think, and there have been, I don't know if you followed them, if that's what stimulated your question, but there have been people who have had visits from federal agents for searches just like that. Shortly after the Boston things, a family, it coincidentally was looking for a pressure cooker, and they were also looking for fertilizer. It was a family on Long Island, and it all came together, and they got a visit. Now, they didn't go to jail, but there's a lot of big hassles in life besides going to jail. I mean, having federal agents show up and having that investigation, it can be very scary, and so I wouldn't do it for fun. I wouldn't do it for fun. Yeah.
Have you experienced any increased scrutiny or pressure from the surveillance mechanism because you are exposing or talking about surveillance?
The question is, have I personally experienced increases in surveillance because of my work on surveillance? not in any national recent sense in any way. I have been in a location in my life where I was very actively involved in a police misconduct controversy and had a very high-profile role. And at that point, I did get a search warrant served on my house, and it got trashed from top to bottom. So I have had the experience of paybacks. But no, this stuff is I mean, it is still in large part a free society, and this sort of thing is not going to set off any triggers. I think his idea, that's going to set off triggers.
When you say privacy is increasingly irrelevant, do you mean by that that it's increasingly less important or increasingly less protected?
When I say that, repeating the question, when I say that privacy is less and less relevant, am I saying that it's no longer important, or is it no longer working? Is that
It's not an important concept.
okay? I think I'm saying kind of all of the above, but I do want to like back up here and say something very carefully. When I say that privacy is toast, that's in the context of a talk about how to think about surveillance. Were I wearing my activist shoes, were I like working in politics, which I don't do anymore, but I used to, I would probably still use the right of privacy as a point of argumentation, because it's the only game in town. Politicians here, we're intellectuals trying to figure out what's up with surveillance, and in that context, I think privacy has been less and less useful as a way to come to understand things. I would have to sort of smack my activist self on the head too and say that privacy isn't working so well in the activist arena either. It's not working very well in the courts. There's been a few high-profile cases that have been successful, usually involving the home and the invasion of the home. But other than that, it just really hasn't been helping out much. So, in terms of our intellectual mission, and this is hard because there's a library shelf about this long just on your question. On the intellectual mission, which is how do we understand the surveillance society, I would argue that privacy kind of gets down to one little dimension of the issue, so it's very partial. And in terms of the political struggle, I would argue it's just not working. But I would say that also part of the reason I'm frustrated with privacy, actually kind of mad at privacy, is that it's been a monopoly for 120 years. There has been no other meaningful counterpoint to surveillance for 120 years, and it's kind of crushed other ideas. We could be talking about power, we could be talking about egalitarian principles, we could be talking about liberty, we could be doing what they do in Europe, which is we could say, you own your own data. So you own your credit report, and they have to pay you to use it. There's all sorts of different ways to talk about this, but in the United States, we've kind of had one idea, privacy.
Isn't the idea that you own your own data included in privacy? Is that you have a right to your own data and that other people aren't allowed to use it?
It overlaps, but in the niceties of law, it actually falls more under property law than the special niche of privacy that's been created in American law. But private property and privacy are, intellectually in history, they go kind of back to the same origins, but they've separated. Yeah, Larry.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about the kind of lack of a vocabulary to discuss this as a public issue.
Right.
Is there any prospect that the U.S.-EU free trade agreement discussions might generate some kind of a way to discuss this in a public forum?
Okay, we talked about sort of the vocabulary bankruptcy in the United States on how to talk about surveillance and the possibility of our interaction with Europe on commercial issues sort of helping import some language for us. And I think that's probably one of the most promising things. I am actually a rarity in surveillance studies, which is a field of study. I'm a rare scholar in that I am an American. Almost everybody else is Canadian, German, British, or Australian, because there's just a lot more interesting stuff, a lot more interesting research going on in their lives, and so there's the graduate schools over there are cranking out people, whereas here it's kind of been confined to law schools and a couple of social and political science departments. And I think that the interaction, the globalization with Europe is probably going to be one of the most promising sources for that. It has certainly been a huge source of challenges to groups like Google, and you probably know the stories about Google Street View and how their cars aren't allowed to take pictures of people's houses in Germany, which Americans like why couldn't I take a picture of your house? Well, it's considered to be a violation in Germany, and so Google hasn't been able to do it. They have to cover the imagery.
You talked about things in America and
Yeah.
Europe. How about things in Asia, especially those regions without Google, YouTube, or Facebook?
I have no knowledge or experience or research in that area.
Do you think it's worth research projects?
Oh yeah. Oh, and there are other people doing. I mean, David Murakami Wood is doing a whole project on surveillance in East Asia. So I could point you to stuff. It's just not anything that I'm ready to do a cafe chat about. Yeah.
What kind of fields of study are encompassed in your surveillance study? I mean, is that like more math, or is it like
Okay, so the question was, what fields of study are encompassed in the field of surveillance studies? Primarily social sciences. Anthropology, I'm thinking of people now and trying to remember their fields. Anthropology, sociology, there are some hybrid programs called Society and Technology Studies, which are really a vibrant source. Political science has a small amount. Some of the law schools have got programs which are doing interesting stuff. But it's kind of an amalgam of social science research, and then we rely on our friends in electrical engineering and computer sciences to actually explain to us what's happening behind the scenes, because we can't figure it out ourselves. And so there's a lot of collaboration there. Yeah?
Can you elaborate more about how to discuss the civilians in terms of power? And would that be a critical view?
Oh, yes, I can. So the question was, could I elaborate on talking about surveillance in terms of power, the other P word, and would that be a critical word? That's actually, if we do tip our hand towards what we think would be a productive route to talk about surveillance, the other P word, we call it power, is what we use. There's been a bunch of recent work in political science and sociology trying to understand the power dynamics at work in a surveillance situation. And I believe that there is some fruitful ground there to talk about the inequality of access to information, to algorithms, to knowledge about what's going on. And in public policy in the United States, that has actually been one of the more, I think, fruitful routes to not limiting surveillance, but making people more comfortable with it. And that is to give someone access to the surveillance about you. So as the result of recent laws, all of you can now, once a year, get a free credit report from each of the agencies evaluating you. So you can see what your credit rating says, whether they've got mistakes about you, and things like that. There's also groups working to get more and more access to different types of information, and that increases the power of the citizen to see what's going on. So I do think I think that's a very prescient comment that you've made.
I guess my question is, I understand that we're getting more and more comfortable with the idea of willingly letting private companies and social media and various online services and things essentially monitor us, survey us, and learn about us so that, services can be made more personalized
Right.
and better for us. But, what's the answer to, maybe it's not even privacy, but so much as the idea of always being watched and having, like, your life being known to plenty of people you don't know, and just everyone knowing everything about each other. I just can't see people being comfortable with that in the future, no matter how used we get to, clicking the box and
Okay.
clicking agree. I still think we're uncomfortable with the concept, and I just don't know what the answer to that is.
Could everybody hear that?
No.
Okay, so the comment, and it sort of, I'm chagrined to say summarized about 15 pages out of our book. It basically said that even though we're signing up for this stuff and we seem comfortable with it, how are we really going to get used to or live with the concept that we're always being watched all the time with everything recorded? And then he said, I'm not sure there's an answer to that. And I think that's probably the best, the best response. What I would say is that there's a lot of really interesting work on that, on the impact of constant exposure, of knowing that it's all recorded. And that's part of the reason, and this loops back to your question earlier, that's part of the reason why we argue that things like Facebook are complicit with things like the FBI, because Facebook contributes to the idea that you're always being watched. It contributes to that awareness of constant surveillance, which if you think about it from a social control perspective, if you think about, okay, how do I manage my population? You want people to think they're being watched all the time. That's actually one of the dangers of writing books like this and giving talks like this, is because I'm making everybody totally aware of the fact that they're being watched all the time, and I'm actually contributing to the power of surveillance by doing that. I think you'd probably be freer if you were like, you know, ignorant and just messing around, because you go and live your life in a more traditional way. And so I think that would be really productive. I'll stop really soon. You look like you're coming to get me or something like that. One of the really interesting arguments that I've read, and I've actually had it made by students in the class that I teach here on surveillance, is that we're going to hit a point, and this is a really challenging insurrectionist idea, I think, that we're going to hit a point as we move into surveillance where we're all going to become so totally aware of everybody's oddities and idiosyncrasies and misbehaviors that we'll actually find more freedom in complete transparency, because we'll learn that, like, everybody's doing it. You know, you look at these maps of where people are looking at pornography on the web. You know, the first thing you find out is that, like, all of America is looking at pornography on the web. And then you look at Utah, and it's like, they're the porn center of the universe. Okay? And then you read these data on, you know, how many people have used marijuana, how many people have done this, how many people, and you slowly realize that we're like in this society of miscreants. And maybe there will be some sort of new freedom found in total transparency. I don't buy it, but I got some friends who make that argument. Right.
Let me play like anti-government and say, I click I agree on Facebook or whatever, and okay, Facebook can sell my data to vendors, but I didn't give them the permission to give it to the government. How do you say, by clicking I agree, are you saying Facebook can give my data to President Obama and he will then, in a sense?
I'm saying that they have been, and they are, and you've been played. There are all sorts of stories I could reach back and find of dudes who, like, this one guy in Seattle robbed a bank, cut to Mexico, updated his Facebook posting saying, with pictures of where he was, extradition agreement set up, and he's sent home. So it's happening all the time. And
No legal,
no,
legal recourse vis-a-vis Facebook.
none that have been successful that I'm aware of. Do you got to pay me more? I'm not getting paid. Don't kid yourself.
Take one more.
Okay, one more. Yes.
Are you more concerned by maybe the surveillance of ordinary people on other people? Because I've read cyber stalking is going up, so should we be more worried about maybe an ex-boyfriend than the data companies?
Repeat the question. Is there a chance that we should be more worried about, like, personal stalking, ex-boyfriends, things like that, sort of like acquaintance on acquaintance, rather than companies? I'm not going to like balance out the threats in your life, but it's certainly a very relevant concern, and there have been, there are lots of stories out about individuals being able to track and follow and identify the location of other individuals and create major havoc or violence in their lives because of it. And it's something that we talk about in the book, and so it's something that the group is aware of. Another thing sort of spinning off of that we haven't really talked about today is there's this idea of what's called by some scholars surveillance, which means watching from below. And if you think of situations where, for instance, a citizen with a cell phone takes a picture of a police misconduct, so somebody with less power using surveillance to approach somebody with more power. Or for heaven's sakes, me, like when I buy a car and I'm trying to figure out which one to get, I can go on Consumer Reports and I can get other data about miles per gallon, cost, accidents. So I'm doing surveillance on one of the most powerful corporations in the world, which builds my power against them. Or voting. You can go to one of the voter sites, votesmart.org, and you can look up the voting record of a member of Congress and totally get all the information you need in one glance to act effectively. So surveillance has been raised as kind of a counter idea to surveillance, where people like you and me can use it to push back. But it's a great question. Okay. Thank you, John. Thank you.